Welcome to Seems Like History. Season 1, Episode 2, Elizabeth Ann Bushong's Applique Quilt, Newmarket, Virginia. My name is Loretta Allen, and welcome to the second episode of Seems Like History. I am a writer, independent researcher, and amateur quilt historian. In each episode of this podcast, I take a look at one quilt, the artist who made it, and the world as she knew it. If you feel the need to hear a brief history of quilting in general, you can find that at the beginning of episode 1. So you may not think that a square of cloth and some stitches have much to say about history, but you'd be surprised. So come along with me as I take us to the Shenandoah Valley in the beautiful state of Virginia in the middle of the 19th century, where we'll take a look at a gorgeous applique quilt dated 1855 and the Civil War battle that it lived through. Elizabeth Ann Bushong, also known as Betsy or Betty, was born on the 7th of February in 1826 in the beautiful state of Virginia. She was born to Jacob Bushong and his wife Sally Strickler, who were married in 1818 after a 4-year courtship. Jacob once wrote to Sally, quote, "Though I am not of wealth, I have a treasury of love for you." Jacob's parents, Henry and Barbara Bushong, were of German stock, whose ancestors arrived in this country in the 1730s and settled in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. Henry's branch of the family made their way to the Shenandoah Valley, where they bought land and started a family. In 1818, Jacob and Sally took up residence on the property that used to belong to Jacob's father, but now belonged to Sally's father. They built a house and started their family. The first 2 of their 6 children, Sally and Caroline, did not make it to adulthood. The younger 4, Harrison, Elizabeth Ann, the quilt maker and subject of this episode, Anderson, and Franklin, lived to a ripe age by the standards of the day. In 1826, when Elizabeth Ann was born, the United States was just 50 years old and smack in the middle of the era known as the Westward Expansion. John Quincy Adams was the president at the time, and fiction that romanticized America's earlier years, like James Fenimore Cooper's Last of the Mohicans, was first being published. The first railway in the United States opened at Quincy, Massachusetts that year. The Erie Canal was completed. And the event that happened that year that would most likely have the biggest cultural impact on humans for the next few centuries, and in my opinion, maybe ever, was that the very first photograph was taken in 1826 in France. But closer to home, the year Miss Elizabeth Ann was born was also the year that both Thomas Jefferson, the 3rd president of the United States and fellow Virginian, died on the same day as John Adams, the 2nd president. In America, the first half of the 19th century would find some of the most optimistic people on the planet. With economic growth and territorial expansion, it seemed as though America was indeed a land of boundless opportunity for those of European descent. Most Americans who lived at the time would agree on that assessment. However, there was one expansion that Americans did not all agree on, and that was the expansion of slavery into new territories. With a stroke of a pen, Thomas Jefferson had made the international slave trade illegal in the United States in 1808. Of all the slaves shipped from Africa in the international slave trade to other destinations, only about 6% were sent directly to British-held North America. The rest ended up in the Caribbean and South America. Part of the reason for that was the enslaved people held in those other countries did not reproduce like they did in the American South, and so the Caribbean and South American countries constantly needed an influx of new slaves. So while the international slave trade ended in the United States, the domestic slave trade flourished, and the enslaved population in the U.S. nearly tripled over the next 50 years, and that growth mainly coincided with the rise of cotton. By the time of the Civil War, most slaves in the United States were 3rd, 4th, even 5th generation Americans. As new territories in the West began to open and be accepted as new states, the question of whether slavery would be allowed in those states became a matter of very heated and sometimes violent contention. Most people could see the writing on the wall. A dark storm was gathering. It's doubtful that Elizabeth worried about those things growing up. Her family did own 3 slaves whose sleeping quarters were in the loft above the kitchen, which was a separate building from the house. In 1825, Elizabeth's father Jacob built a new and bigger house to accommodate his growing family. It faced south toward the town of New Market. According to the museum website, quote, "The house reflects the federal architectural style from 1810 to 1830 with a symmetrical 3-bay front, pediment portico, and vertical lines. Wooden clapboard construction with limestone foundation and a wooden shingle roof are common elements of homes in the Shenandoah Valley. The Bushong property was about a mile from the town of New Market and sits on high ground, just a hop, skip, and a jump from the Shenandoah River. The Shenandoah Valley is a corridor nestled between the Blue Ridge Mountains to the east and the Allegheny Mountains to the west, running in a southwest to northeast direction. Even though the valley is about 145 miles long, it's only about 25 to 40 miles wide, depending on where you're at. The Massanutten Mountain, which is one long mountain on the eastern ridge of the valley, is clearly visible from the Bushong house. The New Market Gap, which divides the mountain into north and south sections, is also visible from their front porch, and it would become very important to control that gap during the Civil War. The Shenandoah Valley has been described as pastoral, tranquil, a land of unrivaled beauty and abundance. It's also the place that at least a third of my own ancestors called home. Elizabeth lived at a time of unprecedented changes in our country. When she was just 22, the California Gold Rush began in 1848, and it was also the year that the first Women's Rights Convention happened at Seneca Falls, New York. How aware she was of the events happening in her country is unknown, but she would have been acutely aware of the battle her parents were engaged in to remain in their home. When Elizabeth's maternal grandfather, Abraham Strickler, died in 1836, her parents became embroiled in a legal disagreement to be able to remain on the property. Jacob fought for the right for his wife Sally to be able to inherit the land that they lived on from her father. Daughters were not usually given land, especially if there were sons to inherit. But by the time Abraham Strickler had died, Jacob had bought all the land surrounding his house and outbuildings from his father-in-law. The only thing he didn't own was the property where his house was. On the farm, they had built an ice house, a separate kitchen, a barn, a chicken coop, and several other outbuildings, like a wheelwright and a loom house. They grew many crops, including wheat. To Jacob, this was decades of his hard work. He didn't want to have to rebuild all of that just a few acres away. They finally won the legal battle in 1847 when Strickler's other heirs decided to sign over the property to them. Something else that might have affected Elizabeth directly was the arrival of the sewing machine in the United States in the late 1840s. By the early 1850s, ads for the new machine flooded the newspapers of Virginia. The task of clothing the family usually fell to the women. The sewing machine sped up the production of clothing within the home, allowing more time for quilting and other leisure activities. In the Mid-Atlantic region, the broderie purse applique quilts were very popular. Broderie purse literally means Persian embroidery in French. That's where the quilt maker used a chintz fabric and cut out the motifs printed on that fabric, and then appliqued them down onto a different, plain piece of fabric, creating a design. Sometimes they embroidered around the edges with a tiny buttonhole stitch. In the years since Elizabeth's birth, the Great American Pieced Quilt and their various block patterns was catching on like wildfire, which would have also been aided by the advent of the sewing machine. By the mid-1800s, the pieced block, the repetition and grid-like arrangement of similar blocks, became the predominant format for American-made quilts. By the mid-1830s, the textile industry in America was booming. Factories in New England bought cotton from the South and employed thousands of women who produced cloth in a great variety of colors. Cotton print fabric was now inexpensive and widely available. This allowed quilt makers to really focus on color and design and allowed women of a lower socioeconomic bracket to join in on the fun of creating beautiful quilts. But for many women, the applique quilt was the style that they used for a Sunday best quilt, the type of quilt that showed off their design and needle skills, the type of quilt that you put on the front bed on Sundays in case the minister came around to visit. Elizabeth Ann Bushong and the other women in her house most likely bought inexpensive cloth from local dry goods and merchants. Applique work has a long history, of which examples exist from the 10th century. Applique motifs were a faster solution to decorating household furnishings than crewel embroidery work, and as it became economically difficult for American housewives to obtain that precious chintz fabrics from Asia, the applique in American quilts began to change too. Now, quilters cut shapes like flowers from solid or calico prints. By the 1840s, Elizabeth Ann and many other American quilters would use the famous red and green color scheme for their elaborate applique quilts, a trend that would endure for many years. So ask any quilt historian or collector about the mid-19th century red and green applique quilts, and you'll likely see their face light up. The quilters from about 1840 to 1875 often used red and green fabrics to cut flowers, leaf, and vine motifs and then applique them down on a white or cream background. Sometimes there was an accent color or two, usually yellow, pink, and occasionally blue. Of course, there's no set in stone range of dates. Some red and green applique quilts show up a little earlier and some a little later. Part of the reason why it's so difficult to pin down dates on what patterns and types of quilts were made when is because what we have left of these 19th century quilts is not representative of all the quilts that were ever made. We're only making academic assessments based on the quilts that have survived. Around 1850, a new aniline dye was introduced that was more color-fast than previous dyes. According to the book Red and Green, an Applique Tradition by Jenna Kimball, the color green was produced by first dyeing the fabric yellow and then over-dyeing it with blue, which made green. The problem is that the two colors don't always fade at the same rate or at the same time, which is why some greens you see in older quilts today are tan or sometimes bluish. Another new product was the color turkey red, named that because it came from the Mediterranean area of the world. This was far superior in color fastness than other red dyes, which is also why it sold for 3 times the price. While turkey red had been available in other parts of the world for many years, it wasn't until about 1840 that we see it in the U.S. American mills did not dye or print turkey red until after about 1869. From 1825 to 1840, one of the favorite ways to make an applique quilt was to make 4 large blocks with identical applique motifs on each one. Shortly thereafter, the applique quilts start to have 9, 12, even 16 smaller blocks with the applique designs on them. However, at the time of the great applique craze, the women making those applique quilts most likely wouldn't have called it applique. Most of the time, those types of quilts were referred to as laid work because the pieces were laid onto another piece of fabric. As with all things in the quilt world, there were exceptions, of course. Ladies' Workbox Companion, for example, used the term applique, but a cursory search of the newspapers that I did brought up the term laid work several times. In 1850, Elizabeth Ann, then 24, was listed with her parents in the census, along with 3 of her brothers and her maternal grandmother, Barbara, who was now 83. The slaves listed in the 1850 census for the family were a 74-year-old black woman, a black male aged 19, and a mulatto female aged 14. In 1855, Elizabeth Ann Bushong would put the final stitches into a red and green applique, or laid work, quilt. We know this because she had the forethought and maybe just a little sympathy for us future quilt detectives and signed it with her initials in the center flower along with the year 1855. The quilt measures 92 inches by 90 inches. It has 9 different applique blocks of various arrangements of flowers, vines, and leaves, and it is hand quilted. The 9 blocks are a combination of different calicos and cottons, all with the red, green, and goldenrod or cheddar color scheme. Documentation for the specific names of applique patterns is sparse and would vary greatly according to region anyway. And even more reclusive is documentation as to how women acquired those patterns. There's very little in the historic record that suggests at the time Elizabeth was making her quilt that there was a source or a place where she could purchase her patterns. So it's possible she either designed this quilt herself or she borrowed somebody else's pattern. One block in Elizabeth's quilt is a combination of a rose and tiger lily, and another one looks like a Mexican rose wreath, while another is a bud and rose wreath reminiscent of a rose of Sharon, and yet another is a daisy wreath. One of the blocks is a wreath of grapes and grape leaves, which would later be repeated all over the border. The center motif was originally a green flower, which has now faded to an olive tan color. On the 7 white petals that were appliqued in the center of it, the date and initials are embroidered. Outside of that center green flower is a circular scallop of goldenrod colored fabric, which is probably supposed to represent the next outer layer of the flower petals. And surrounding the goldenrod petal is a red scalloped petal. This particular central motif is noted on several quilts in the Shenandoah Valley at the time and looks as though it's a variation of Fortune's Wheel. At the very bottom of the quilt is a flower pot filled with flowers, but on each side of that pot begins an elaborate grapevine that flows up the sides of the quilt and then encompasses the whole center. Along that grapevine border are grape clusters with little tiny perfect grapes all appliqued down. My favorite part of the quilt, though, and I doubt Elizabeth Ann would appreciate this very much, is that the flower pot is slightly crooked. I find that adorable. This is an astounding quilt. The border is nearly as wide as one of the blocks. I wonder, what inspired the layout and the idea for this quilt? Did she start appliquing the center squares and then thought, oh, I'll add this grapevine border? Or did she think, I'd love to do a grapevine border on a quilt, but first I'll need to come up with some blocks worthy of it. It's difficult to say which particular dyes were used in the fabric of the quilt without some sort of documentation or examining the quilt up close. But other than some fading in the green, the quilt is still remarkably vibrant. The quilt is currently housed in the Virginia Military Institute Museum. Amazingly, this was not the only quilt that Elizabeth made at that time. The Virginia Quilt Museum in Dayton has another quilt made by her using many of the same paisley fabrics from her applique quilt. However, the quilt at the VQM shows off more of Elizabeth's piecing skills than applique skills, and they were just as good. The pieced quilt at the VQM is a variation of what we call the New York Beauty. It contains 64 quarter circle fan blocks separated by applique flowers and sashing with curved corner posts. The colors used in this quilt were red, green, cheddar, think cheddar cheese, and maroon on a cream background. It measures 87 by 87 inches and is hand quilted. The border is appliqued with flowers that look like they're standing in a garden waiting to be picked. This is definitely not a pattern for beginners, as it requires the points to be tiny, precise, and sharp, which Elizabeth achieved with excellence. And while this quilt is not dated, the use of many of the same fabrics support the fact that it was made around the same time as the applique quilt. Elizabeth, still unmarried, would have been about 28 to 30 years old when she made these. About the same time Elizabeth was hard at work on her applique quilt, the Kansas-Nebraska Act was signed into law by then-President Pierce. This act repealed the Missouri Compromise, which had outlawed slavery above the 36th parallel in the Louisiana territories. Senator Stephen Douglas of Illinois introduced a bill that divided the land immediately west of Missouri into 2 territories, Kansas and Nebraska. He argued that settlers of the new territories should be the ones to decide if slavery would be legal there. Anti-slavery supporters were outraged by this because under the terms of the Missouri Compromise of 1820, slavery should have been outlawed in both territories since they were both north of the 36th parallel, which was the dividing line between slave and free states. It can get confusing because Missouri is also above the 36th parallel, but it was brought into the nation as a slave state to balance out Maine, which was also admitted to the country at the same time as a non-slave state. But apparently the Missouri Compromise was intended for any new states west of Missouri, not already existing states. As soon as the Kansas-Nebraska Act passed, pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers rushed to Kansas, each side hoping to determine the results of the first election held after the law went into effect. Only things turned violent, like really violent, and earned the territory the nickname Bleeding Kansas. This just aggravated the split between North and South on the issue of slavery all the more, until reconciliation seemed virtually impossible. In fact, you could say that Kansas and Nebraska was sort of a microcosm of what was going on in the whole rest of the country. The country was, indeed, one step closer to the Civil War. On a tour of the seaboard slave states in 1853 to 54, author Frederick Law Olmsted wrote about the great feast of food he received throughout Virginia. Just one meal included the following: fried fowl, fried bacon and eggs, cold ham, peach and grape preserves, hot wheaten biscuits, hot shortcakes, hot corn cakes, and hot griddle cakes soaked in butter. There was coffee, sweet or sour milk, and whiskey to drink. Virginia was the land of plenty, with apparently all the food you could eat. A decade later, Virginians would be surviving on much less. In 1857, a 14-year-old slave belonging to Elizabeth's father named Mary gave birth to a boy named Israel on July 3rd. In the 1860 census, on the brink of the Civil War, the slave Mary and her 3-year-old son Israel were still with the Bushong family, as was a 27-year-old male slave. Up to this point, it seems as though the Bushong family never had more than 3 slaves at a time. One book says that slavery was not a major issue with the citizens of Shenandoah. Only 9% of the Shenandoah population in 1840 were slaves, and most of those were owned by the English and Scots-Irish. However, the book also went on to say that even if slavery wasn't a big issue for the people of the valley, the defense of one's property was another matter altogether. And so the people of the Shenandoah became very much involved in the Civil War. And as most had predicted, Civil War came to the United States in April of 1861 when Confederate troops fired on Fort Sumter. There are many reasons for this clash between the Southern way of life and the Northern way of life. The 3 main issues were slavery, states' rights, and economic differences, and economic differences sort of circled back to slavery. One commentator in the periodical American Cotton Planter of 1853 put it rather bluntly, quote, "The great limitation to production is labor." In other words, the South could not maintain its growth, prosperity, its production without the free slave labor. Cotton was wildly profitable and created the antebellum South and its way of life. States' rights kind of also circled back to slavery because the Southern states wanted the right to keep slavery legal without repercussions from the federal government. Stonewall Jackson's Valley Campaign arrived in the Shenandoah Valley in the spring of 1862. Jackson and his men spent at least 46 days in the Shenandoah Valley that year. There was a vast amount of agricultural wealth in the Shenandoah, as it produced nearly 20% of the grain grown in the entire state. This was one of the reasons the valley was targeted during the Civil War, that and the New Market Gap that I mentioned earlier. General Ulysses S. Grant looked at the valley and the New Market Gap as sort of a backdoor to Richmond, which was now the Confederate capital. It was a lot easier to get troops through the gap than it was to go directly over a mountain or around it. The Bushong family were hit hard by war. In a letter written April 23, 1865, Jacob wrote to his son Frank Bushong stating, quote, "They still have enough to eat and to wear, though as to the wearing we have to make out with things we would scarcely thought fit to be seen in. Now we patch and fix up the old clothes until we make ourselves believe that we look right." In the spring of 1864, Union offensives swept through Virginia. Union General Franz Sigel, a German immigrant who had only been in the country for about a dozen years, was given the task of marching up the Shenandoah Valley to capture Stanton, about 45 miles south of New Market, where the Bushongs lived. But things didn't go as planned. Confederate General John C. Breckinridge, who was a former vice president of the United States, had gathered forces and marched to oppose Sigel's advance. Breckinridge and his army came into a position near the town of New Market, taking advantage of the high ground on Shirley's Hill, which looked down onto the Bushong farm. On May 15, 1864, Sigel's army was strung out over miles of the valley. This meant he was bringing his troops in piecemeal. Meanwhile, Breckinridge waited with his whole force to see if the Union would attack. Breckinridge had also called in a corps of cadets from the Virginia Military Institute, a group of about 247 teenage boys. Among them was the great-great-nephew of Thomas Jefferson. Breckinridge hoped that he would not need to use the cadets in the fighting. By around noon on the 15th of May, when the Union troops had not attacked, Breckinridge went on the offensive. By the afternoon of May 15th, it had been raining for nearly a week, and the ground was good and soggy. Near the orchard in the wheat field, just 500 yards from Jacob Bushong's house, a small battle would gain nationwide attention and become known as the Field of Shoes. The heaviest fighting occurred in the wheat field that had just been planted a few weeks before and was now growing knee-high. Cadet R.H. Cousins later recalled the scene, quote, "We then went past the house and got into the orchard where canister and other missiles were raining like hail. It seemed impossible for men to pass through such a storm." One of the cadets, John Howard, described the scene as, quote, "I look back upon that orchard as the most awful spot on the battlefield as the shot and shell tore over and around us." The soldiers became bogged down in the field that had turned to mud, sucking their shoes right off their feet so that they were unable to retrieve them. When a gap opened in General John Breckinridge's line, he couldn't shift his troops to that line to close the gap fast enough, so he regretfully turned to the young cadets. Breckinridge paused and then said, "Put the boys in, and may God forgive me for the order." And inside the home of Jacob Bushong were 7 family members. Jacob and his wife Sally, their son Anderson and his wife Elizabeth, their 2 children Willie and Carrie, and our quilter, Miss Elizabeth Ann Bushong, were all present in the house during the battle. 3 generations hunkered down in the cellar, listening to the calamitous thunder of cannons and the cries of the wounded. The family could see the feet of the soldiers marching by their windows as the force of Confederate soldiers split in half and passed around the home. The battle raged all day, and heavy casualties ensued. At the end of the day, Breckinridge was able to turn back the Union Army and allow the valley to stay in the hands of the Confederates for a little while longer. This was one of the last victories for the Confederates in this region. A few short months later, the Union troops would come through once again with General Sheridan, and the outcome would be very different for the beleaguered Confederates. On May 15, 1864, on the Bushong farm, around 43 Confederate soldiers lost their lives, including 10 of the teenage cadets from the VMI. The great-great-nephew of Thomas Jefferson, Thomas G. Jefferson, was among the casualties. He was only 16 years old. Nearly 475 Confederates were wounded and 3 were missing in action. However, the Union took the heavier casualties as 97 Federal soldiers were killed, 520 were wounded, and 225 were missing in action. Upon coming up from the basement, the Bushong family found nearly 1,000 dead and wounded men scattered throughout their fields and farm. The family leaped into action, with Sally and Elizabeth stripping the dining room table to use as an operating table, while Jacob and Anderson began carrying the wounded into the house. It didn't matter to the Bushongs which side the wounded fought for. They reportedly treated all the soldiers with the same care and respect. It would be weeks before the last of the wounded would leave the farm, and bloodstains can still be seen on the wooden floors today. Perhaps one of the most pitiful deaths of that battle was that of 19-year-old VMI cadet Bev Stannard, who had written a letter to his mother just a few nights before the battle, talking of how he hoped that he and his fighting brethren could defeat the Yankees. During the battle, he and his roommate from the Military Institute, John Wise, were told to guard a baggage wagon, but they disobeyed direct orders and joined the cadets marching to the front. Bev's leg was badly mangled by an artillery blast, and he bled to death on the front porch of the Bushong farm. Bev's last words were, quote, "I fell where I wished to fall, fighting for my country, and I did not fight in vain. I die with full confidence in my God. My loved ones must meet me in heaven." It is said that the Bushong farm was one of a handful of farms that were spared the fire and flames of General Sheridan when he came through the valley later that fall. Many believe it's because Sheridan had been told about the kindness the Bushong family showed to all the wounded soldiers. 10 days later, the Stanton Spectator said, quote, "The Corps of Cadets, though they never witnessed a battle before, acted with the steadiness of veterans and fought with the courage of Trojans. Though their beloved comrades fell thick and fast by their sides, they faltered not, but kept their line well formed and continued to advance upon the enemy's battery in spite of its destructive fire, which was mowing down their ranks like grass before the scythe. It's interesting to note that back in Pennsylvania, the northern branch of the Bushong family, these would be cousins to the Shenandoah Bushongs, found themselves engaged in humanitarian aid as well. The Pennsylvania Bushongs were staunch abolitionists whose home was one of the Underground Railroad stations. Henry Bushong was what was called a station master, and not only ushered several slaves further north and east with the help of fellow abolitionists, but also allowed several escaped slaves to convalesce in his home. One escaped slave had injuries to her back from a whipping that left her back, quote, a mass of mingled flesh and jellied blood. It's fascinating to me that when it came down to it, both branches of this family, the northern Pennsylvania branch and the southern Virginia branch, all rendered aid when it was needed most. The Bushong home and farm is now owned by the state of Virginia and is a historical monument. A few years back, when general upkeep and renovations were being done to the house, museum workers found that an iron shot from a 3-inch Hotchkiss canister round, most likely from federal troops, landed in the north wall of the Bushong house. I mean, how close that family came to utter destruction. I can't help but wonder if Elizabeth Ann had taken her precious quilts down to the cellar when they went to hide from harm's way. I mean, I would have. I would have been like, wait, I'm taking my quilts. Jacob Bushong passed away in 1873. In his will, Jacob Bushong divided his assets among his wife, all his children, and all his grandchildren, regardless of their sex. Elizabeth Ann never married and continued to live with various family members until her death in 1907 at her nephew Jacob's house where she had been living. A clue as to how respected and loved Elizabeth Ann was in her community is evident by her lengthy obituary in the Shenandoah Valley newspaper. Quote, Miss Elizabeth A. Bushong, who had been more active and in rather better health than usual, was suddenly taken sick Wednesday morning, March 6th, with chills, grip, and pleurisy pains, and later her heart began to fail, and the following Monday morning she died at 1:25 o'clock, aged 81 years. Miss Bushong came from an old and respected family and was well known in this community, being a kind, useful woman and possessing many noble traits of character, which were always manifest. She had many friends. The person who inherited Elizabeth Ann's quilts was her niece, Mattie, who was the daughter of Anderson Bushong by his second wife. Mattie went on to have only one child, Evla, who died just 6 months after her mother, Mattie, from an apparent heart attack while milking the cows. Since Evla never married and never had any children, most of the mother's and daughter's belongings were willed to a family friend named Henry Buell, who, recognizing the historical and artistic value of Elizabeth's work, in turn donated Elizabeth Ann's quilt to the Virginia Quilt Museum. In 2019, the museum hosted a quilt-along inviting modern-day quilt makers to make a replica of Elizabeth Ann's New York Beauty variation. Both of Elizabeth's quilts can be viewed at their respective museums, and both the Bushong house and farm are open for tours. In fact, this coming February 7th, 2026, is the 200th birthday of Elizabeth Ann Bushong, and the museum is hosting a tea in her honor. You can find information about that event on their website. The Civil War is such an epic, grand, sad, tragic event in American history that most articles, no matter how meticulously researched, will just never do it justice. It is estimated that about 600,000 soldiers died in the Civil War, but recent research suggests that the number could be closer to 750,000. So that represents 2.4% of the U.S. population at that time. If you took 2.4% of the population today, within just a couple years. There is a movie based on the Newmarket battle called The Field of Shoes, which I deliberately did not watch because I didn't want to be influenced by a fictional account of the events. But if you're interested, you might want to watch it. The two quilts made by Elizabeth Ann Bushong lived through a Civil War battle and are still here to be admired by people 150 years later. What must it have been like to emerge from the safety of their basement cellar on that day to look out upon their normally serene and tranquil farm to see almost 1,000 men, either dead or wounded. Their field must have run red with the blood of young men, each fighting for what they believed in, some just defending their homes without much of a political opinion on the larger issues at all. Quilts are like historical documents that are a record of the lives of ordinary people and a glimpse into the often overlooked women of the time. Elizabeth Ann's needle skills were divine, a testament to her determination and hard work. Her design skill alludes to a woman full of vibrance and whimsy, a woman who saw the world in full, rich, vibrant color. This podcast was written, researched, and edited by me, Loretta Allen. You can find Seems Like History on Instagram and YouTube, where I've made a slideshow to accompany this podcast. That's Seems Like History, SEAMS. Textiles are perishable, so it is of the utmost importance that these old quilts be documented and preserved. Let's give a voice to those ghosts from the past. I would like to thank the Virginia Military Institute, the Virginia Quilt Museum, and the Jacob Bushong Farm Battlefield for their generous assistance with photographs and information. Join me next time when I take us to the Berkshires in western Massachusetts in the middle of the 19th century and discover Charity Brown's beautiful pink Lemoyne Star quilt and the corner of the world that inspired some of America's greatest literary classics.